Getting to the heart of the matter. Back to Guy, Ben, and Frank with more Inside the News.
Welcome back to Inside the News. Glad to have you with us. And we have conversations off the air during the commercial break. We've got Frank Vernuccio, top left. My name is Guy Wehman. And in the bottom middle, we have Ben Brunson. Ben, you brought up an interesting point about how much money we're spending on this COVID, or proposing to spend, the 1.9 trillion. And you made an interesting observation. Go.
Well, it's not just this bill. We ran a $4 trillion deficit last year. We're going to run a $2 to $3 trillion deficit this year. We're spending trillions like drunken sailors, and yet we can't find $100 billion to put towards our grid, which, by the way, would be serviced by high-paying jobs, union jobs for the most part. So we've had this issue to reinforce our grid. It's been an issue that's been talked about and bantied around in Washington for decades. Everyone knows it's a real issue. Our entire economy, our entire well-being, the lives of Americans is completely dependent upon our grid. And yet we can't dedicate money to this. It is an infrastructure project. For some reason, as Frank mentioned before, there's an endless debate over who should pay. Let's just spend some money, since we're throwing so much around, to reinforce our grid, to rejuvenate our grid, EMP harden our grid, and then reinforce it where we need it to help California, which has these Texas-sized problems, have been ongoing for years now, with rolling blackouts around the state. Texas, we just watched them go through a meltdown because of the weather. A very rare weather event that hit the state hard. But this is worthwhile. We are completely dependent on electricity. And if anything, where we are going as a country is to increase our dependence on electricity as we move towards electric vehicles and other electric things that are viewed as green, as opposed to the old school economy. So I don't understand why this is so tough.
I want to stick on that before we get to Iran. Frank, what is interesting is that they killed the XL pipeline. That is a very clean way of transferring that energy source of oil from Canada down south to the Gulf of Mexico. But you're going to replace that now with rail, and there are a lot more rail derailments going on, and maybe trucks and everything else that's going to actually cost more. And yet the Green New Deal, they are so obsessed with anti-oil that they say if we kill the XL pipeline, then that's anti-oil. That's going to serve our cause. It's actually going against their cause, isn't it, Frank?
Well, let me answer Ben's question with two facts. Number one, you're absolutely right, Guy. This is an attack against fossil fuel energy. There's a belief that if you continue to limit the ways that you can spread energy around, then eventually we'll be forced to go to some green dream that will give the alternative sources of energy. That worked real well in Texas lately, didn't it? The other issue is one of politics. The fact is, the type of jobs that would be created by improving our electrical grid are not the type of jobs that help the Democrats. These are blue-collar jobs, a lot of them in blue states, which in red states rather, which simply don't help the Democrats. And so they'd rather see the electrical grid remain vulnerable and put that money elsewhere into things that do help Democrats. And that really is those two reasons are the real reasons why we're not addressing the grid problem. Both of them are horrible reasons. Both of them are dirty, filthy politics at its lowest level, putting the health of Americans and the security of the nation as a whole behind the needs of the Democrat Party. We are faced with a reality in our country where too much of the population believes that loyalty to the Democratic Party is more important than the good of the nation itself.
Kind of reminds you of party uber alles, doesn't it, Frank?
Indeed, that's exactly what it is.
Okay, Ben, we've got to get to Iran and the policies that Pelosi and what's going on here in Washington, D.C. This is scary stuff, Ben.
Trump had two great foreign policy successes. One was redefining China as the real threat and outing China as a real threat. The other was in throttling Iranian ambition and money flow. He reimposed sanctions on the Iranian economy. What the practical effect of what he did is he forced the Iranians to sell their oil at a big discount, a steep discount to the market. You can't stop them from selling oil, but you can force them to sell it at half the market price, which dried up their bank accounts. And the result in the Middle East over the last 4 years was that terrorism and violence fell dramatically because the primary funder of terrorism and violence in the Middle East is Iran. Mm-hmm. They use their money to fund Hezbollah, Hamas, the Assad regime, the Houthi rebel movement in Yemen. They are the main funders of violence, the Shia militia groups that operate inside Iraq. These are all funded by Iran. And the first thing Biden has done is open the financial spigots for Iran. He has already removed a lot of the sanctions that caused Iranians to sell their oil so cheaply. So now Iran is getting rich again, which means they can fund all these proxy battles and wars all over the Middle East. So the direct result of Biden policies is you will see a significant uptick in violence around the Middle East funded by Iranian money. Why the love affair of Iran in Washington among Democrats is inexplicable to me. I don't know how the Iranians somehow penetrated the Democratic Party, but they've done it quite successfully. And immediately on January 20th, you saw the effect of a different administration, and it's going to lead to a lot of war and chaos in the Middle East.
You wonder if they followed the playbook that they went after Congressman Swalwell on, Frank.
Go back, if you will, to about 4 or 5 years ago, actually closer to 5 or 6 years ago, and run the tape of this show 5 or 6 years ago. And one of the things that we discussed several times was the inexplicable policy of the Obama-Biden administration towards Iran. We talked on those shows 5 or 6 years ago about how all of our traditional allies in the Middle East were being tossed aside by Obama-Biden and replaced with a tilt towards Iran. And as soon as Biden got into power, that 4-year wonderful interlude where we didn't have to put up with the Obama-Bidens, Iran was basically stuck. They couldn't do their dirty deeds. They were losing funds. They were, down to their desperate measures financially. The second Biden came back into power, that inexplicable Obama-Biden policy tilt towards Iran came back. In a democracy, in a republic, a president doesn't have to follow public opinion polls and policy, but he does owe an explanation of what his policy is. We have never seen that, either Obama, Biden, or Biden.
All right, we've got to get out of here because we're hard up against the break. This is Inside the News. We'll be back.
You're listening to Wehman, Brunson, and Vernuccio, Inside the News. Here's Guy, Ben, and Frank.
Welcome back to the program. This is Inside the News. We are celebrating our 6th year. This is program number 298. That's right, 298 programs. In a couple more weeks, it'll be program number 300. And we want to thank all of you listeners that have been with us for the entire 6 years. And we thank you so much. We thank you for all the new affiliates that are coming on board from week to week. And we thank you as well. You can catch us on the AUN TV network. We thank Rick Trader. And on YouTube, WBV Inside the News is how you find us there. Frank Vernuccio, top left. Ben Brunson in the bottom. And you know what? We've got a lot yet to talk about. We just talked about it just briefly, but inside the January 6th insurrection, Frank, go.
Well, it was hardly an insurrection. There is increasing information that there was chatter long before January 6th between Antifa, BLM, and others about a disruption at the United States Capitol. If, in fact, that pans out, as I suspect it will, it'll indicate that nothing that Trump said or did had very much to do with what happened at the Capitol on January 6th. And indeed, very little had to do necessarily with Trump supporters. This is something that I think the media has decided to use the same way the Nazis used the Reichstag fire in the 1930s in Germany. That became sort of an excuse for the Nazis to suppress dissent. And I think we're seeing the same thing with this incident at the United States Capitol.
You know, that's an interesting point there, Frank, because when you bring up that comparison, then it brings into account our First Amendment, the freedom of speech. Then it brings into the right to bear arms, our Second Amendment, and we go on down the list. And Ben, you were nodding your head during that during that comment.
Well, the left keeps calling this an armed insurrection, which it was not, thankfully. Had there been a bunch of AR-15s being brandished about during that riot on January 6th and the incursion into the Capitol building, we would already have had legislation probably passed at least through the House to confiscate assault weapons in this country. The Democrats want to go there anyway, but they would have used that absolutely as an excuse to gin up support for that. They're trying to do it in a manufactured way. They keep talking, as I said, about an armed insurrection, and it was not an armed insurrection. This was an incursion, a protest into the Capitol building. There's no doubt there were those in the crowd who wanted to see some type of forced re-inauguration of Donald Trump and an overthrow of the orderly business of Congress to approve the November election. There's no doubt about that. But I think for the vast majority of people who were there, they were just trying to protest and to throw their weight behind some attempt to kick the electoral college process back to the states. That was the goal of, I think, most of the people who were enthusiastic in that crowd. So that's the reality of it. And it is, to me, it was a protest. It was not an insurrection, and it was certainly not an armed insurrection. And the people have that right to protest. They did not have the right to barge into the Capitol building, but thankfully they did not try to burn the building down, unlike what we saw over the summer and fall, in which Antifa protesters actively tried to burn down government buildings, courthouses, police buildings, and other government property, and very active attempts to destroy the US government. And at that point, if I recall, Nancy Pelosi described federal troops or officers who responded to that to protect federal buildings as stormtroopers. So how things change depending on who's doing what.
I'm going to skip down a couple of points here, Frank, because it dovetails with what Ben was talking about and what we're talking about. Law enforcement is now on their own. The support that they got from Donald Trump across the country after what happened last summer, and and that I've got your back and all, I believe that is going to be gone, and it's going to be tough sledding here, I think, for a lot of police departments, sheriff's departments, and law enforcement across the country, Frank.
Yeah, and it's interesting how the defund the police movement is morphing in different ways. In various large cities, while the defund thing didn't work out very well, we look, for example, I believe it's Minneapolis, where that worked out terribly. Now they're hiring police again. But what is going on in major cities throughout the United States is castrating the ability of the police to do their job. For example, in New York City, we have a serious problem with violence committed by homeless individuals, homeless who are also mentally ill. The word has gone out from City Hall in New York, from Comrade de Blasio, that the police are not to interact with the homeless, no matter what they're doing. So if a police comes across a homeless person who decided, for example, to urinate in front of a restaurant, the police officer is powerless to do anything. He has to call up social services, who will send out a representative to talk to the homeless person. So you're seeing, while defunding didn't work out well, it was trial ballooned and the public rejected it. You're seeing the powers of the police to do their job taken away, piece by piece by piece. I've had the opportunity to talk to police captains in New York City who are utterly frustrated at the fact that they simply don't have the legal ability any longer to do their job. That's become the way the police are being, if not defunded, then certainly wiped off the face of the map in terms of their ability to do what has to be done.
Ben, the Democrats are literally dancing on the head of this pin, and they're putting, okay, defund police, Black Lives Matter, the COVID-19, and they're going from one to another, creating another crisis to another crisis, and they haven't completed and solved anything, but yet they're stirring up all this trouble, thinking, well, if we stir up the trouble, we'll come in and say, we're the savior, we're going to fix it. But that is exactly out of another playbook, isn't it?
We have a multi-front assault on policing in this country underway. We have DAs like Larry Krasner in Philadelphia and the new DA out in LA that are put in office by the money of George Soros, that are trying to decriminalize everything. In San Francisco, you can steal from stores up to $950, and that's a misdemeanor. And the police don't do anything anymore. Stores are powerless to stop people from walking in, filling up a cart and just walking out of their stores. That's the reality. This is chaos. Crime is skyrocketing in these blue cities. And it's being hidden by a lack of reporting of that crime. You know, crimes that don't get officially reported apparently don't exist. Well, they do exist. They are happening, and they're happening in absolute unbelievable numbers, exceeding, I say, the darkest days of what was going on in the late 70s in New York City and other cities. We've created something. We didn't try to stop the police in the late 70s. They were just understaffed, and we are in a desperate situation in these cities. It will lead to an increased depopulation. Hey, it's great for Florida real estate. You put a house on the market in Florida now, and you're getting multiple bids in about 48 hours. That's great, but that's not the right answer. Right. The right answer is that I want to see a strong, healthy America from coast to coast. And I love the blue states. I love New York. I love California. And it is heart-wrenching to watch what's going on. Go talk to a police officer in any city like LA, San Francisco, Seattle, or New York, and they will tell you that crime is skyrocketing, and they don't even bother to officially report most of what's going on. It's an abysmal situation.
Yeah, you buy real estate, stay away from my rainforest behind me, would you? We have to take a break with our Picking Up the Pieces segment. We'll be back.
You're listening to Wehman, Brunson, and Vernuccio, Inside the News.